Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here this week with Artur Wilczynski. He is a former senior intelligence official. I think he's currently with the University of Ottawa. And yeah, just we've been 3 weeks now of all these stories of alleged foreign interference. And there's a lot of somewhat misleading stuff going on in the discourse. So I figured I'd talk to Artur and try and demystify some of what we're hearing and try and put some of this into perspective. So I think, first of all, the one thing I keep hearing is intelligence is not evidence. And can you unpack that for me?
Sure. I think that that's one of the fundamental mistakes that people make, is that they use intelligence and evidence interchangeably, and I think that causes Canadians and others to misunderstand what exactly makes its way into intelligence products that then are consumed by policymakers. So evidence is something that meets a certain threshold of due diligence. Evidence is something that is tested, that is based in a judicial process, in an adversarial process, where someone brings information to an adjudicator. It meets a certain threshold, is tested, and then it's admitted as evidence because it reaches that threshold. Intelligence isn't that.
Yeah.
Intelligence is the collection, and intelligence comes in many shapes and sizes. But generally speaking, intelligence, particularly as it is collected by governments, is a process whereby through various techniques, whether or not they are human sources or electronic sources, information is collected. Oftentimes it is collected in a covert or a clandestine way. In Canada, we do that through through the legal framework that we have that gives the sort of the parameters, the rules of the game for organizations like the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, or the Communications Security Establishment, or CSE. And that information is collected. It is then analyzed, and it is then reported. And it doesn't have to meet that high a threshold, right?
Right.
Right? If we've heard it and it comes from a source, it can then make its way into an intelligence report. And oftentimes these intelligence reports are just part of an information ecosystem where what is available through the media, what is available through academic research, what is available through just personal experience is the vast majority of the information ecosystem. Intelligence, particularly intelligence provided by government, is meant to complement that broader information ecosystem.
Mhm.
And then under the totality of all that information, particularly again in the government context, people make policy decisions. It is very rarely if the role of intelligence to make decisions. It's around complementing that environment. So the threshold for
Mhm.
what goes into that is much lower than what would go into an evidentiary standard.
And I'm assuming that not every piece of intelligence is going to be correct. And so
No,
there's got to be a way of kind of sorting through all this to
100%.
make sure that you're matching
Right.
facts with other facts.
So what often happens, the other part of intelligence that I should have gone into, is the whole concept of intelligence assessment, right? So assessment is actually a discipline where experts look at that information ecosystem and make judgments on the validity and the reliability of information, the probability of certain outcomes. So it's partially art and partially science, because there is sort of a method associated with it. But absolutely, in terms of what goes into intelligence, for example, in human intelligence, oftentimes sources will intentionally lie. they will intentionally mislead in order to try and elicit a particular outcome from policymakers. So it's still worthwhile to report that, source X said thing Y, but you need to put it in its appropriate. Is this a new source? Is it an established source? Do they have certain motivations that you might need to bear in mind as you're considering the validity of the information? And that's part of the analytical process that then often goes to policymakers to make decisions about it. So, on the signals intelligence side too, like part of the role of a signals intelligence agency is to collect information from, all the digital platforms that are out there, acquire the information that we have the legal mandates to acquire, analyze it, and then report it. But you know what? Even when you do that, people lie to one another.
Yeah.
So, let's say, for instance, you're intercepting a conversation between terrorist X in country Y and terrorist, 2 in country 3. They often lie to one another. Or they try and exaggerate each other's, effects. You still want to report potentially on that kind of conversation because it's important, and within a broader information ecosystem, it can help you understand dynamics. But you have to be very careful not to just sort of say, okay, Joe said, X to Jane must be true. Whether that source is a human source or whether that source is an electronic source. And that's why the assessment and that whole engine is so important in terms of understanding what you're reading and what you're hearing. That's a long-winded answer. I apologize.
No, that's fine. And I'm guessing that the stuff that we're reading in the media, we have no way of determining how much of it has been analyzed, how much of it is a finished product, how much of it is something that we can rely on with any degree of certainty.
Right. I mean, I think it's very, things that make their way into the public environment. Again, I haven't seen any of the documents. I also have no reason to doubt the professionalism of journalists. Journalists have their sources. Journalists have their standards. It's up to them. But I think that most Canadians don't necessarily understand what they're reading when somebody quotes something as being an intelligence source or an intelligence report. It should not be taken as absolutely correct and absolutely true. It is a piece of information that is meant to be shared with decision makers, so that based again on that totality of information that they have, they can make informed decisions that are in the national interest. And and sometimes for a variety of reasons, people might take information and go, okay, thanks, and park it. Because they have other sources of information that they perceive to be more reliable or more, ones that they have more experience with. And sometimes intelligence makes its way into decision makers' inbox where, they cannot make any decision that is influenced by that piece of intelligence, because doing so can compromise the sources and techniques, because outside of intelligence, there would have been no way for an individual to know that a certain piece of information that would elicit a particular policy response. So it's a very complex kind of system. There are many actors involved in an intelligence production system, and one of the big problems in Canada is that we never talk about it, ever. And then so you have the stuff that's very exciting and oh my God, titillating and all this wonderful exciting information that makes its public domain, and people don't know what to make of it, and they just sort of make certain assumptions which are unhelpful. And then when you put that in sort of a toxic partisan environment, it just becomes an absolute cluster fluff that we're living through today, where it is an absolute horrifying for Canadian democracy. And I kind of like building from there. So much of the reporting is also predicated on this notion that there are memos or briefings that happened. And I've had other people like our friend Stephanie Carvin who's saying
there is no mechanism by which a lot of this stuff filters upward. We don't propel it up very well in Canada. So we don't know what these so-called memos are, what these so-called briefings are, and if they make it to PMO or if they just go in someone's inbox and it just kind of.
Let me tell you that as somebody who's done, I played a number of roles in my career. Most of my career, I was a consumer of intelligence. Okay. And finding the right piece of information that actually helped you wasn't easy. And then oftentimes, like this is one of the problems in the Canadian government, both on the political and on the public service side, is that we don't actually do a very good job in terms of training consumers of intelligence of what to do with it. We make it remarkably difficult for them to acquire it. We don't tell them how it fits well into that system. And there's a real, intelligence illiteracy in government that negatively affects consumption of intelligence products. So that's one problem. Okay. And then distribution of intelligence, making sure that the right piece of information makes to the right person at the right time is another problem. And so we're not good at any of that in a particular way. So that's a big bugaboo of mine, just sort of institutionally. And so on top of that, getting that kind of intelligence to the prime minister, literally champagne corks get popped when, within the collection community when a piece of intel actually makes it all the way up. It's the same thing if something makes it into the presidential daily brief, it's like, woohoo, you put that you frame that report and you put it on your wall and you go, that one made it. So it's exceptional. So that, it particularly raw reports. It is very, very rare that a raw piece of signals intelligence or a raw piece, and by raw means non-assessed and not analyzed, makes its way to a senior consumer like the prime minister. Their time is precious. There is a lot of intelligence to consume across a vast universe of intelligence interests. Produced by Canada, but also by our Five Eyes partners. So getting that attention from senior policymakers is not that easy. And, even if it says for the attention of, who knows if they actually read it, right?
Yeah. One of the other pieces that we're talking about a lot right now is NSICOP or NSICOP, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
Depends who you ask. If you ask David McGuinty, he has one way. If you ask others, they've got others.
Yeah. And I've written about this a fair amount in different outlets. But one of the things that is kind of, I guess, that the dialogue right now is that this is a secret committee and that nobody can talk about what happens there. So therefore, it's useless as a mechanism by which to assess what we've heard in this kind of intelligence and stuff. And that doesn't really ring true to me because their reports are made public with some redactions, but there's a prescribed list of what is able to be redacted. And I'm just wondering if you can just kind of walk us through what some of this means.
So the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is a relatively new review body. Yeah. And it was specifically created because in the Canadian context, there was no previous mechanism whereby elected representatives to the House of Commons or members of the Senate would be able to have some engagement with Canada's national security and intelligence organizations to ensure that the way that they operated, the policy frameworks that they were responsible for, were actually in the national interest. There was no mechanism before, and a big part of the concern was that parliamentarians would turn national security into a partisan circus. So that's why, and we can have that another part of that conversation when we talk about other committees. Yeah. But that's why there was a particular legal framework created to enable the Prime Minister to name a range of parliamentarians from both of the House of Commons and the Senate to make sure that these individuals would be cleared to top secret status, where they would be able to review anything that was of interest to them. Mm-hmm. that they would be able to do that in a safe and secure way with a professional staff that would be able to support them in their responsibilities. And that because much of the work would take place in that kind of in-camera session, though not necessarily, it would take the partisanship out of the review of the intelligence community so that they could do their job in an effective way and in a manner that reflected a broad consensus in amongst Canadian parliamentarians. And you have, Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, Bloc. You've got all the recognized parties in the House of Commons who sit on this committee, and they decide, and it's usually by consensus, what are the issues that they want to review. So whether or not it's diversity in the national security and inclusion in the national security community, through to the role of national defense and intelligence. I mean, they've got a broad agenda, and then they can request both individuals, experts, and senior officials to come to testify and answer questions to them, and they can also review all of the highly classified documents that are prepared. And then they deliberate. They ask certain questions. Is this in Canada's interest? Are they doing it properly? Are there things that are being missed? Are they doing it effectively? What are the risks that are out there? And they develop a certain expertise by being on this committee because they're exposed to this information. So the questions they ask, the recommendations they make, end up being quite thoughtful and informed. The problem continues, though, is that there isn't, in the absence of an atmosphere of crisis or an atmosphere of significant activity, their reports have tended to not garner a whole lot of information, of interest. I mean, they are informative there because you can go to the website. God knows they try to promote them. They've got far fewer followers on Twitter than you and I do, but they're still on because they're trying to talk to Canadians, and it's not easy. So I actually do think that they're a really effective body. They could do a whole lot more. And I think so can our agencies in facilitating that culture of transparency that is important for our intelligence communities to have the social license to operate in Canada.
All right. And I think, I guess my only thing about NSICOP is that the political executive has not followed up on their reports enough. And which is something that I think, if we had a more mature political culture, then we would have parliamentarians saying, why aren't you responding to these things?
100%.
Until a situation like now where they're using that against it.
But this is exactly it. That I completely agree. I think that this is where I think that there could be a little bit more political maturity in terms of some of the opposition members on NSICOP, NSICOP, your pronunciation of that weird acronym, where they can say, hey, we made unanimous recommendations on issue X. We issued those 2 years ago. You haven't even acknowledged them, and hold the government to account. That's where you can bring the. You don't have to sort of say what the classified aspect is, but you can totally say we have made reports on the following issues. We made some important recommendations to the Prime Minister that affect the operations of our national security and defense agencies, and they have said nothing, and that is not in our national interest. We were created specifically to do that. We've been doing it in a nonpartisan way. The government's silence on this is incompatible with us having a broad consensus on the role that these, the pointy end of the security stick has, the mandates they have, and whether or not they're doing it in the national interest. So there's lots of ways for opposition parliamentarians to continue to hold government to account, even though some of the content remains classified.
All right. Well, I think I've kept you for long enough, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And
no problem.
I'm sure we'll do it again in the future.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.